my goal by the time I'm done is to make you question everything you know about the 10mm. Hello everyone and welcome back to AmmoMart.com. I'm really excited to be with you today because we're going to talk about my all-time favorite pistol caliber, the 10mm auto. Now the odd thing is, it's my favorite, but my goal by the time I'm done is to make you question everything you know about the 10mm, and importantly, I'm going to expose this guy for the charlatan that some of the rounds on the market actually are. In previous videos, we've touched on the history of the 10mm auto and how it was closely tied into the .40 Smith & Wesson. So we're going to hit some of the high spots from that previous conversation and throw in some more information as we go. So the original concept for the 10mm goes as far back as John Browning, who was messing around with the concept in a 1911 style gun, which I personally think is what that gun is, or that caliber is best suited for. It sort of went to the dustbin of history for a while until a 1983 Miami shootout saw that the FBI was looking for a more powerful handgun caliber. Right around that same time, Colonel Jeff Cooper and another fellow were developing a version of the 10mm auto. This is where we have to really start paying attention to the facts. Jeff Cooper's recipe, let's call it that, was at a level of power that was significantly less than the FBI would ultimately try and did adopt. That's important that we hold on to that factoid, okay? So we have a level of power with Colonel Cooper's, and sort of picture that in your mind. It was significantly more powerful than the 9mm, but not the 10mm recipe that's in circulation today in most cases. As time went on, a company called Dornis and Dixon encouraged Norma Ammunition, which at that time was a Swedish company and is now recently in the process of being acquired by Beretta, developed a 10mm cartridge for use in the CZ75 styled Bren 10. That's important because Dixon and Dornis believed that the round needed to be substantially more powerful even than Colonel Cooper's, and it was. They developed a cartridge for use in that pistol, and we have what most people would consider the 10mm auto. The problem with the Bren 10 was the launch was an absolute disaster. Firstly, the magazines were unreliable, and the next thing that happened was a lot of those guns were actually sent to dealers without magazines at all. Not terribly handy. And even in 1980s standards, the magazines were almost $50 a piece. So after 3 years of relatively bad performance manufacturing-wise, Dixon and Dornis went out of business. And the gun probably would have once again returned to the dustbin of history, except for two things. First significant thing was the Colt Manufacturing Company decided to release the 10mm auto cartridge in a 1911 style pistol called the Colt Delta Elite. And it was a fabulous gun. Like I said, I think it's best suited for the 1911 platform, and people really seem to like it. Another odd thing that happened was the television show Miami Vice. And a bit of cosmic fate, as the show became more popular, so did the Bren 10. Perhaps it shouldn't have because of its bad reliability history, but the facts of the matter are that gun was routinely selling for $1,500 when the original MSRP was $499. It was very similar sort of circumstance that you saw with the .44 Auto Mag in the Sudden Impact and Dirty Harry movies. Very similar situation. Watching all of this and still trying to develop a more powerful load for their carry guns was the FBI, of course, and they looked at using the Smith Model 1076, shooting the 10mm bullet. The problem was, every time they went to qual day for their agents, it seemed more like shotgun training. The gun was large, the recoil impulse was very heavy, and their agents quite simply did not shoot that gun very well. So, some experimentation began to lighten the load, and Federal Ammunition led that sort of research, and they developed the 10mm light or 10mm FBI load. which was a significant reduction in power compared to the original 10mm auto. Through that experimentation, a light bulb went on and the FBI decided, well, why don't we cut the case? Because when we lighten the load and keep the 10mm auto in its 25mm full-length case, it didn't cycle very well in the Smith Model 1076. So yeah, it was a lot less recoil. The problem was the gun didn't work very well. Next thing that happened was, as I said, they cut the case 1/10 of an inch, and now you have a reliable sort of operating system, but it became the 40 Smith & Wesson because it retained the same characteristics as the FBI light load, just in a smaller case. Earlier I referenced that I was going to expose the 10mm cartridge that most people understand today. Talked about that earlier in the video. So here's what I mean. Part of my duties is I am a manager of a ballistics laboratory, and it's a really cool process where we use test barrels and transducers, and end of the day what we develop is what kind of pressure and what kind of velocity does any particular caliber have. One of the things I noticed right away is I began to test 10mm auto rounds, whether it was stuff that we were producing or other manufacturers had produced, was it doesn't really have a ton more power than the 40 Smith & Wesson, if at all. Before I shot this video this afternoon, I grabbed some random manufacturers' 10mm rounds and I did a ballistics test on them. And what I found was, and I won't list the manufacturer because it's really not important, they all pretty much do this unless you have a very specific one. They all run right around 25 to 28,000 pounds per pressure, even though the SAMI spec on a 10 mil is 37,500, and they're all running right around 1,000 feet per second, sometimes less, and that's 200 feet per second slower than the actual SAMI spec, pushing 180 grain projectile. And what I find interesting about that is the same manufacturer's 40 Smith & Wesson ran the same pressure on average, and the bullet was right around 150 feet per second slower. That's it. Presumably, with the longer case, you can get this little more speed out of the 10 because you're using a little more of a powder charge, but at the end of the day, not a significant difference in the average range rounds purchased for 10mm auto as compared to the 40 Smith & Wesson. I think a lot of people are going to be shocked by that. And if you don't believe me, look up the ammunition that's in your closet. See if you can find some data on it. And I think you're going to find, unless you really spend a lot of time and educate yourself on what type of manufacturers make those bullets with the power they were intended to have, you're probably going to be disappointed. I'd like to leave you with some final thoughts about the 10mm auto caliber. In a sense, we have at least 3 different versions of it, and it has a clearly defined past. The question is, what's in the future? In my humble opinion, I think the 10mm will probably not continue to grow in vast popularity. And it has 2 basic reasons why. Firstly, as some people out there might already be aware, it's basically a 40 that you have to pay more for. Then, if you decide, either by doing your own reloading or purchasing the actual full power 10mm auto rounds, most people won't like that. Just like the FBI found out in the late 1980s, power comes with some problems. It has some inherent issues the more we increase that. Yes, you do get a revolver, a Magnum revolver sort of power with a flat trajectory in a rimless case, but you're always trading something to get something, and one of the things you're going to get is a very strong recoil impulse. So don't be fooled. It's going to always have interest, and there will always be 10mm aficionados, but I do not see the caliber exploding in any way in its current form.